The wind bit deep, a cruel, icy breath that swept through the skeletal branches of dormant trees. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that made your breath plume like dragon smoke. Outside the flickering neon sign of Edna's Eats, a diner that looked as worn and weathered as the town itself, a small figure huddled against the brick wall. He was a boy, no older than 8, his thin jacket offering little resistance to the biting wind. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, tears freezing on his cheeks before they could even fall. Passers-by, bundled in their own hurried warmth, cast fleeting glances but kept walking, their faces shielded against the elements and perhaps against the sight of a child in distress. It was a scene that had become all too common on this unforgiving street, a tableau of quiet despair that most chose to ignore. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the comforting smell of fried onions and brewing coffee. Jack, a construction worker whose hands told stories of hard labor and whose face was etched with the lines of a life lived outdoors, wiped down the counter. His co-workers, Leo and Mike, were hunched over steaming mugs, their laughter a sharp contrast to the desolate scene outside. They were already halfway through their lunch break, the easy camaraderie of men who faced the world together. Suddenly, Jack's gaze drifted to the diner window. He saw the small, shaking form against the brick, a stark silhouette against the fading light. His brow furrowed. It wasn't just a kid. It was a kid who looked utterly alone, swallowed by the vast indifference of the afternoon. His co-workers continued their boisterous conversation, oblivious. Jack's gut tightened. He knew that feeling of being invisible, of being too small for the world to notice. He thought of his own younger sister, how vulnerable she had seemed even on the sunniest days. A silent question formed in his mind. What was this child doing out here, all by himself in this brutal cold? He glanced at Leo and Mike, who were now debating sports scores with their usual animated energy. He knew their teasing, their ribbing. They'd call him soft, a bleeding heart. They'd laugh. But the image of the boy, his small frame battling the wind, was already lodged in Jack's mind like a splinter. He hesitated for only a moment, the warmth of the diner a stark contrast to the harsh reality outside. Then, with a sigh that was more resolved than weariness, Jack pushed himself away from the counter. He had to do something. The cold gnawed at him, but it was the chill of the boy's isolation that truly made him shiver. This wasn't just about a crying child. It was about a quiet plea for notice, a silent test of humanity that hummed beneath the surface of this busy, uncaring world. Jack opened the diner door, and a gust of frigid air swept in, carrying with it a challenge. Jack walked out, a man stepping from the warmth of comfort into the bite of the unknown. The co-workers inside barely looked up, their world of burgers and jokes securely insulated. But for Jack, the world had just shifted, its focus narrowing to a single, shivering point of light in the gathering twilight. The boy flinched as the diner door opened, expecting another indifferent gaze or, worse, a rebuke. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and wide, a mixture of fear and a flicker of something unnameable, perhaps a sliver of hope. He saw not a passerby, but a man whose weathered face held a surprising gentleness. Jack knelt down, not caring about the icy pavement that bit through his thin work pants. He spoke softly, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Hey there, kiddo, you look like you could use a friend." He extended a hand, rough and calloused, but offered with a sincerity that the boy seemed to swallow whole. The boy hesitated, then slowly, tentatively, placed his small, cold hand in Jack's. It was a fragile connection, a bridge built across a chasm of loneliness. Jack's co-workers, Leo and Mike, finally noticed the commotion, sauntering to the doorway, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Whoa, Jack, you found yourself a stray?" Leo jeered, a smirk playing on his lips. Mike chuckled, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. They saw Jack's kind gesture as an opening for their usual banter, a chance to poke fun at their friend's perceived soft spot. Jack ignored them, his focus entirely on the boy. He could feel the desperate chill radiating from the child's tiny hand. He didn't need their approval, their judgment. He just needed to help this small, lost soul. "It's awfully cold out here, isn't it?" Jack said, gently straightening up. "Why don't you come inside with me? We can get you something warm to drink, maybe a bite to eat." The offer was simple, direct, and laced with an unspoken invitation to safety and warmth. The boy nodded, his gaze still fixed on Jack's face. He hadn't spoken a word, his voice seemingly stolen by the wind and his own quiet sorrow. But his willingness to follow, to trust this stranger, spoke volumes. Jack gently guided the boy into the diner, the bell above the door jingling a lonely welcome. The warmth of the diner enveloped them, a welcome contrast to the biting exterior. The smells of food, the low hum of conversations, the clatter of plates. It was a world away from the cold, empty street. Jack led the boy to a booth by the window, the same window through which he'd first spotted him. "Have a seat," Jack said, his voice still soft. He slid into the seat opposite the boy, creating a small pocket of warmth and protection around him. Leo and Mike stood in the doorway for a moment longer, their laughter tapering off into awkward silence as they saw the genuine concern etched on Jack's face. Jack pulled out a worn menu, its pages sticky with past meals. He offered it to the boy, who looked at it with the same wide, uncomprehending eyes. "Anything you fancy, kiddo." "My treat." The words were casual, but the sentiment was profound. It was an echo of something deeper, a recognition of a shared humanity that transcended their vastly different circumstances. The boy finally spoke, his voice a reedy whisper, barely audible above the diner's ambient noise. "Just something to eat." It was a plea more than a request, a simple expression of a fundamental need. Jack's heart ached, but he offered a reassuring smile. He flagged down Edna, the diner's owner, a woman with a kind face and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Edna, this young man Acqui wants something to eat, whatever you think is best." "And put it on my tab." Edna nodded, her gaze lingering on the boy for a moment before she bustled off towards the kitchen. Leo and Mike, sensing the mood shift and perhaps a touch of shame, retreated to their own table, their jokes now feeling hollow. Jack watched the boy, who had now slumped slightly in the booth, his eyes scanning the bustling diner with a mixture of awe and apprehension. This was a sanctuary, but it was also a place filled with strangers. Jack knew this was more than just a meal. This was about offering a moment of grace, a chance to feel seen and cared for in a world that often felt vast and uncaring. The boy's quiet vulnerability was a mirror, reflecting a need that Jack, in his own way, understood. He had seen the invisible before, and today he chose to acknowledge it, to offer it warmth. The boy clutched the edge of the worn vinyl booth, his small knuckles white. The sounds of the diner, the aroma of food, the gentle presence of Jack opposite him, it was overwhelming. He hadn't expected kindness. He hadn't expected anything, really, except the continued ache of hunger and the deepening chill of his own aloneness. Edna returned from the kitchen, carrying a steaming plate. It was a generous serving of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, simple comfort food that radiated warmth. She placed it carefully in front of the boy, offering him a small, supportive smile. "Eat up, sweetie," she said, her voice gentle. The boy looked down at the food, his breath catching. It was more than he had seen in days, more than he had dared to hope for. His gaze flickered to Jack, confirming this was real, that this act of generosity was indeed for him. He picked up the fork, his hand still trembling slightly, and took his first bite. Jack watched him, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. It wasn't about the cost of the meal or the praise of his coworkers. It was about that moment, the simple act of offering sustenance and warmth to someone in genuine need. He saw the tension in the boy's shoulders begin to ease, the tightness around his eyes soften. "That's good, huh?" Jack said, his voice a warm invitation. The boy nodded, a faint hint of color returning to his cheeks. He ate with an earnestness that spoke of profound hunger, both physical and emotional. Each bite seemed to fill not just his stomach, but a void within him. Jack ordered himself a coffee, then sat back, allowing the boy his space. He didn't pry, didn't demand an explanation for the child's presence on the street. He understood that sometimes people needed to be seen and cared for before they could begin to share their burdens. The quiet shared space between them was a testament to that understanding. He noticed a small, folded piece of paper peeking out from the boy's jacket pocket. It looked like a child's drawing, creased and slightly smudged. This small artifact, seemingly insignificant, sparked a memory in Jack of his own childhood, of the drawings he'd made for his parents, each one a small piece of his world offered up for their love. The boy paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and instinctively touched the outline of the paper within his pocket. It was a gesture of quiet tenderness, a protective instinct around something deeply held. Jack's gaze lingered on the small protrusion, a silent curiosity stirring within him. What did that drawing represent to this child? As the boy continued to eat, Jack felt a deeper sense of purpose than he usually found amidst the concrete and steel of his workday. This felt like building something real, something that mattered beyond the physical structures he erected. He was building, in this small diner booth, a fragile bridge of trust and compassion. He caught Edna's eye, and she gave him a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the good deed being done. Leo and Mike, now in their distant booth, were quieter, their earlier bravado replaced by a more subdued observation. They were watching, perhaps without fully understanding, the power of this simple, unasked-for kindness. The boy managed a weak smile, a flicker of gratitude that warmed Jack more than the coffee in his hands. It was a tiny spark in the vast darkness of his apparent despair. Jack leaned forward slightly. "My name's Jack," he offered, extending his hand again, this time for a proper handshake. The boy, after a moment's hesitation, met his grasp, his small hand dwarfed by Jack's. The boy finally found his voice, a small, hesitant murmur. I'm waiting." The words hung in the air, simple yet laden with an unspoken weight. Jack nodded, not pushing for details but acknowledging the quiet confession. Waiting for what? Or for whom? This was the beginning of an unfolding. As the boy continued to eat, Jack's mind drifted. He knew the streets of this town, knew the rhythms of its people. He'd seen hardship, had lived through it himself at times. But this boy's palpable loneliness, his silent stoicism in the face of such cold and hunger, struck a different chord. He noticed the boy's jacket more closely. It was thin, threadbare in places, clearly not warm enough for this frigid weather. It was the kind of garment that offered more symbolism than actual protection against the elements. It spoke of a need that went beyond the immediate pangs of hunger. "That's a nice jacket," Jack lied gently, not wanting to highlight its inadequacy, but acknowledging its presence. The boy merely shrugged, his eyes fixed on his food, a subtle tightening around his jaw. He seemed resigned to its limitations, to the many limitations he clearly faced. Jack thought about his own worn work jacket, hanging on the hook by the diner door, a shield against the elements he faced daily. It was a symbol of his own struggle, but also of his ability to withstand it. He wondered with a pang if this boy had anything as substantial, anything that spoke of enduring. The boy's half-eaten meatloaf sat on the plate, a testament to his slow progress. He would finish it, Jack was sure, but the act of eating seemed less about enjoyment and more about necessity. Jack watched the boy's hands, the small, chapped fingers that moved with a quiet, determined grace. They were the hands of someone young, yet they seemed to carry an old weariness. Jack recognized that look, the distant, haunted expression that had sometimes settled on his own face during leaner times. It was the look of someone trying to make sense of a world that often offered them very little. He wondered if the boy had family, if someone was searching for him. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him. To be this young, this alone, without even a proper coat, it was a scenario that tugged at the very core of his protective instincts. Leo and Mike, from their table, were now whispering and looking over. Jack felt their eyes on him, their unspoken questions and the usual taunts they'd unleash later. "Getting sentimental, Jack," they'd say. "Going to adopt him." But Jack pushed their voices and their judgments to the back of his mind. This moment, he felt, was sacred. It was a small, quiet miracle happening not on a grand stage, but in the unassuming corner of a roadside diner. It was a reminder that even in the face of indifference, a single act of human connection could illuminate the darkest corners. The boy pushed his plate away, his hunger seemingly sated, though a hollow look still lingered in his eyes. He wasn't fully warm yet, not truly comfortable. Jack ordered him a hot chocolate, the milk steaming and rich, a better balm for his chills than anything else. As the hot chocolate arrived, the boy reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling slightly with the folded paper. Jack watched him, a quiet curiosity building. It was clearly important to the boy, this small, crumpled secret he carried. The boy finally pulled it out, a child's drawing. It was done in crayon, a vibrant explosion of color attempting to capture something meaningful. A house, a sun, and two figures holding hands. It was a simple depiction, a child's vision of belonging and warmth. Jack felt a strange pull towards the drawing. It wasn't just crayon on paper, it was a message. A message from a soul adrift, reaching out in the only language it knew. He recognized the earnest strokes, the bold colors, as the language of a child desperately trying to make himself understood. He saw the boy trace the lines of the drawing with his finger, a quiet reverence in his touch. It was a tangible piece of his world, a connection to something precious, something he was perhaps clinging to for dear life. This drawing held more weight than any material possession. Jack gently nudged the drawing towards himself. "Mind if I see?" he asked softly. The boy hesitated, then with a sigh that seemed too deep for his small frame, pushed it fully into Jack's hands. Jack unfolded the drawing carefully, mindful of its fragile state. The colors, though smudged, still held a surprising vibrancy. He saw the crude but loving depiction of a house, a bright yellow sun with radiating beams, and two figures, one larger, one smaller, holding hands. It was a picture of a family, of home, of love. It was a snapshot of a world that this boy desperately longed for, or perhaps had lost. Jack felt a surge of empathy, a deep, resonant understanding of the unspoken plea within this simple artwork. He looked at the boy, whose eyes were now fixed on the drawing, a wistful expression on his face. The boy was waiting, but for what? To know if his drawing made sense, to have someone acknowledge the life it represented. That was the question that lingered. Jack carefully refolded the drawing, his fingers lingering on the crayon lines. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, he looked directly into the boy's eyes and said, "This is a beautiful drawing. It shows someone who matters." Those simple words, spoken with quiet sincerity, seemed to land like a gentle balm on the boy's raw spirit. And as that small piece of paper, that symbol of a child's hope, rested between them, Jack knew this was not just a meal, not just a warm drink. Something significant had just occurred, a silent exchange that had changed the atmosphere in their small corner of the diner. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, his grip on the booth loosening. For the first time since Jack had seen him, a genuine, albeit faint, smile touched his lips. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, a testament to the power of being seen. He finally pushed the hot chocolate away, the warmth having done its subtle work. Jack glanced at his watch. His break was almost over. Leo and Mike were already gathering their things, their boisterous energy returning as they neared the door. They'd head back to the site, to the noise and the grind, leaving Jack to this quiet encounter. But the warmth of the diner, the smell of coffee, and the boy's hesitant smile were a stark contrast to the cold reality of the construction site. Jack felt a pang of reluctance to leave. He had stepped out of his routine, out of his usual world, for a reason that was rapidly becoming clearer. He looked at the boy, who was now staring out the window, his gaze lost in the deepening twilight. The boy's initial fear seemed to have subsided, replaced by a quiet, contemplative sadness. Jack knew that a simple meal and a hot drink were not enough. This boy needed more. He reached for the crumpled napkin from his coffee cup, the damp paper a stark contrast to the drawing. It was a small, unassuming object, yet Jack felt an impulse to connect it to this moment, to this boy. He often doodled on napkins, sketches of his own thoughts, or simply random patterns. He picked up a pen from the table, and on that small, stained napkin began to draw. It wasn't an elaborate sketch, just a few quick lines. He drew a simple house, a bit sturdier than the boy, and a single, sturdy tree beside it, its branches reaching upwards as if in welcome. He didn't draw any people. He didn't want to impose his own vision. He just wanted to offer a symbol of shelter, of a place to put down roots. He wanted to give the boy something tangible to hold on to, something beyond the abstract promise of kindness. He pressed the napkin into the boy's hand, the damp paper cool against his skin. "Here," Jack said, his voice calm. "This is a place where you can be warm, a place where you can rest." He wanted to convey a sense of security, of a haven. The boy, his initial surprise giving way to quiet curiosity, unfolded the napkin. He stared at the crude drawing, his eyes tracing the lines of the house and the tree. A faint flicker of recognition, or perhaps just a dawning of understanding, crossed his young face. He looked up at Jack, his gaze surprisingly steady. He didn't ask who it was for or if it was real. He simply held the drawing, his small fingers carefully aligning it with his own crayon creation. It was a silent acknowledgement of connection, of a shared landscape. Jack watched the boy as he cradled both the napkin drawing and his own crayon artwork. These two simple pieces of paper, one a child's yearning, the other a stranger's gesture of hope, had become anchors. They were tangible symbols in a world that felt overwhelmingly intangible and unpredictable for this young boy. He knew his break was definitely over. The sounds of his co-worker's truck starting up outside reached him, a call back to the world he usually inhabited. But a part of him felt tethered to this booth, to this quiet encounter that had unfolded so unexpectedly. He looked at the boy again, a million questions swirling in his mind. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why was he alone? But he held his tongue. The boy had shared his drawing, his silent plea. It was Jack's turn to offer his quiet support, not through interrogation, but through presence. He would have to go back to work, to the noise and the dust. But something had stayed with him, an echo of the boy's quiet vulnerability and the unexpected warmth of their shared moment. That napkin, that crayon drawing, they carried a weight now, a significance beyond their humble form. As Jack finally stood up, the boy looked at him, a question in his eyes that was no longer just about hunger. It was about what came next. Jack offered a reassuring nod. "I'll be back," he said, his voice firm with a promise he wasn't entirely sure he could keep, but he meant it. The boy watched Jack as he walked towards the diner door, the familiar neon sign casting a warm glow behind him. He saw Jack pause, look back, and then step out into the biting wind. The boy clutched the napkin drawing, his small hand seeking the comfort of the house and the tree, then his own creation. He remained seated, the warmth of the diner and the memory of the stranger's kindness, a fragile sanctuary. The cold outside remained, a constant, biting reminder of his precarious situation. But something had shifted within him. He had been seen. He had been fed. He had been given a drawing, a promise. He looked down at his hands, still slightly greasy from the meatloaf. They were small hands, hands that had drawn a picture of a family and held onto a stranger's hope. He was still waiting, but now, perhaps, there was a different kind of waiting, a quieter, more hopeful kind. He traced the outline of the house on the napkin with his finger. He imagined himself inside, warm and safe. The tree beside it felt like a protector, a silent guardian. He couldn't explain it, but this simple drawing resonated deep within him, a small seed of possibility planted in the barren landscape of his present. He glanced at the empty seat opposite him, where Jack had sat. The warmth of Jack's presence, though physically gone, lingered. It was the warmth of empathy, of a shared moment of humanity that transcended the cold world outside. He wondered if Jack understood the true depth of his need, the silent plea that had been captured in his crayon masterpiece. The sounds of other patrons filled the diner, their conversations mundane, their lives seemingly untouched by the quiet drama that had just unfolded. The boy was an island in their sea of ordinary, a secret kept within the yellow glow of Edna's Eats. He was still alone, in a way, but no longer entirely invisible. He looked at his own drawing, the two stick figures holding hands. It was a picture of a bond, of connection. He wondered if he would ever hold hands with someone like that again, if he would ever know the warmth of a home like the one he had drawn, or the one Jack had sketched on a napkin. The faint scent of coffee still clung to the air, a reminder of Jack's presence. It was a comforting aroma, a subtle promise that kindness, even in its simplest form, could linger. The boy took a deep, steadying breath, his small chest rising and falling with a newfound resilience. He knew he couldn't stay in the diner forever. His current reality, however bleak, beckoned him back. But he carried something more than just the lingering taste of meatloaf and hot chocolate. He carried the memory of a stranger's outstretched hand, a shared meal, and two drawings that spoke volumes. The boy quietly gathered his belongings, the crayon drawing and the napkin tucked carefully back into his pocket. He stood up from the booth, a small figure moving with a quiet dignity that belied his age and his circumstances. He paused at the diner door, looking out at the cold, dark street. It was still there, the biting wind, the indifferent darkness. But for the first time since he had begun his lonely vigil, the cold didn't feel quite as absolute. He had a small, crumpled piece of paper in his pocket, a tangible symbol of being noticed, of a connection forged in the most unexpected of places. He stepped out of the diner, the bell above the door chiming its mournful farewell. The familiar chill of the night air enveloped him, but he walked with a new resolve. He was still waiting, yes, but the waiting was now underscored by a quiet hope, a flicker of light ignited by a stranger's simple act of compassion. He looked up at the sky, where the stars were just beginning to emerge, like scattered diamonds on black velvet. One star, perhaps, shone a little brighter than the rest. He thought of the drawing of the sun and the house and the tree. And he knew that even in the deepest darkness, there were places of warmth to be found. The boy's faint smile returned, a ghost of what it might become. He adjusted the pocket containing the two drawings, a small treasure to protect. Then, with a quiet determination, he turned and walked away from the diner, disappearing into the cloak of the night, leaving behind only the warm glow and the memory of a shared moment. He didn't know where he was going, not truly. He was still adrift, but he carried with him the weight of two drawings, two small pieces of paper that had somehow managed to hold back the overwhelming cold, not just of the weather, but of the world. And as he walked, he clutched the napkin drawing, the image of the house and the tree, and a quiet promise whispered in the wind. The sounds of the diner faded behind him, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. He was a solitary figure moving through the shadows, his small frame silhouetted against the sparse streetlights. He was a boy waiting, but now he was a boy with a story etched not just in his heart, but in the very fabric of that crumpled napkin. He remembered the way Jack had looked at him, not with pity, but with a steady, genuine regard. It was a look that said, "I see you." And sometimes that was all the warmth a person needed to keep going, to face the next moment, to hold on to hope. He reached into his pocket again, his fingers brushing against the rough texture of the napkin. He felt the indentations of Jack's pen, the simple lines that represented so much more than just a house and a tree. It was a blueprint for a future, however uncertain, a symbol of a haven. He continued to walk, his steps growing slightly more confident. The cold was still there, the hunger still a dull ache, but the crushing weight of his isolation had lessened. He was no longer just a collection of needs. He was a boy who had encountered kindness, who had found a small piece of himself reflected in a stranger's gesture. He looked up at the vast night sky, a sky that had seemed so immense and indifferent just a short while ago. Now it feels different. It felt like a boundless canvas, full of possibility, perhaps dotted with stars that held stories of their own, stories of people who, like Jack, had chosen to see the invisible. He finally stopped at the edge of a park, the emptiness of the swings and slides a stark reminder of his solitary existence. He sat on a cold metal bench, the chill seeping through his thin trousers. But he didn't shiver uncontrollably as he had before. He had a warmth within him now, a quiet ember kindled by an unexpected encounter. He pulled out the napkin again, its paper now slightly softened by the moisture of his hand. He held it up, trying to make out the drawn house and tree in the dim light. It was a fragile anchor, but it was his. And it was a reminder that even when the world felt like an empty parking lot, moments of profound human connection could still emerge. He then took out his own crayon drawing, its colors muted by the darkness, but its message still clear. He placed the napkin drawing on top of his own, the two images aligning almost perfectly. It was a silent conversation between two worlds, between two different kinds of hope. He wondered if Jack had a place like this, a home. He wondered if Jack had people who cared about him, people for whom he drew pictures. These were not questions he could ask, but they were questions that filled the quiet space around him, questions that spoke of a universal longing for belonging. He closed his eyes for a moment, the chill air on his face, the feel of the napkin and his drawing in his hands. He was still a boy waiting, but the waiting now had a different texture, a texture woven with threads of compassion and the quiet promise of human connection. He imagined a warm room, a sturdy tree, and the steady hand of someone who saw him. He opened his eyes, and the stars seemed to glitter with a new intensity. He knew his journey was far from over, but he had a direction now, a subtle shift in his path. He had an anchor. And that anchor, a simple napkin drawing, was more precious than he could possibly articulate. It was a silent testament to the fact that kindness, however small or unexpected, can indeed leave an indelible mark. As he finally stood and continued his journey, the napkin drawing remained clutched tightly in his hand. It was a promise, a map, a whisper of hope in the vast, cold expanse of his existence. It was a reminder that even when you feel like you're standing in an empty parking lot, the most important things can be found in the smallest of gestures. He walked on, a solitary figure against the vastness of the night. But he was no longer just a child lost in the cold. He was a child who had been seen, who had been offered warmth, and who now carried with him the weight and the wonder of two drawings, two symbols of a hope he was only just beginning to understand.